This video has no visuals because I'm lazy and wouldn't have made this otherwise, so feel free to put this on and switch to a different tab or something. Also, this should go without saying, but this contains heavy spoilers for Persona 4 Golden. If you haven't played the game, please close this now and go play it. It's $20 on Steam and it's worth at least twice that. Go do it. This video is entirely my opinion, and if you feel differently, that is cool and I respect that. So, I just finished Persona 4 Golden, like literally. The credits rolled about 15 minutes before I started writing this script, and man, do I have a lot to say about this game. For context, prior to playing Persona 4 Golden, I did play through Persona 5 in its entirety, but I played it so terribly that I don't think I fully appreciated everything it had to offer. By this, I mean I hardly maxed out any confidants, basically never fused any personas, and didn't really use any buffs or debuffs in combat. I finished the game by turning down the difficulty and grinding, and yet somehow I walked away from it still having really enjoyed it. All that said, I went into P4G with a much clearer idea of what to do, and thanks to some awesome friends who helped me through the game without spoiling it, I feel a lot more fulfilled with my time spent here. So let's talk about the game itself, and I think I'll start with what were the two strongest points for me, the characters and the soundtrack. These two elements were far and away what kept me coming back and wanting to play more of this game. The story was good for sure, and I'll get to that later, but it was really the characters themselves that had me hooked. The cast is fucking top-notch, with only a couple of exceptions. The easy standouts here for me were Kanji, Chie, Yukiko, Dojima, Naoto, and Rise. Those were just my favorites, but I liked pretty much every character here except for one, and that's Teddy. Honestly, I'm sorry to Teddy fans, but there really wasn't a single moment where I found his character to be an enjoyable one. He was kind of like Sanji from One Piece if Sanji wasn't also a total badass. He was just a complete simp who didn't really have anything interesting going for him, and I also really couldn't stand his English voice actor. But in general, I was surprised at how much I liked the main cast here, especially compared to the Phantom Thieves from 5. The investigation team / Seekers of Truth seemed much less like a band of misfits and much more like a genuine group of friends. I feel like there was a lot of time spent just showing everyone hanging out together and showing the player that these characters don't solely exist to fight monsters. They're just regular kids going to school, making meaningful friendships and having fun. I found myself genuinely excited to advance everyone's social links and get to know their characters, which is pretty rare for me when it comes to media. I'm much more of an observer when it comes to things like this and don't often get too invested, but I'm glad that P4G broke that trend for me. For the first time in a long time, I was actually kinda sad to see these characters go when the credits rolled, and I'm really gonna miss that group of characters. On the music end of things, there really isn't much to say other than I was just consistently amazed by how good this soundtrack is. As someone who puts Persona 5 soundtrack at the top of my bangin' soundtracks list, I didn't think another Persona game could top it, but this one just might have. It's really hard to compare the two because they set such different tones across the board. Persona 4 goes for much more like a chill, cozy vibe, while Persona 5 is all about the jazz. Favorite songs here, and there are a lot, are Heartbeat Heartbreak, Your Affection, Signs of Love, Nevermore, Time to Make History, Reach Out to the Truth, Like a Dream Come True, I'll Face Myself, especially the final boss version, Specialist, The Almighty Thog, Everyday Sunshine, and Long Way. Honestly, there's probably a ton more, but I was too lazy to go through the entire soundtrack again, so there you go. Shit bangs. Let's talk about the story, which overall for me was pretty good, but there were a couple of things that had me a little mixed. The first thing I'll say here, and it's probably a mix between a story criticism and a gameplay one, is that it is far too easy to miss a lot of stuff here. Between having to pick the exact right dialogue options when confronting Namatame in the hospital, having to max out Marie's social link before defeating Adachi, though at least the game hints at that one for you, and then the most egregious, having to go back to Junes after having talked to all your max social links on March 20th. If you don't do the correct things in these situations, the game just ends, and while in the case of the Namatame situation, it's pretty clear that the game shouldn't end there, the true ending situation was not. If you don't go back to Junes on March 20th, the game just ends in a way that feels satisfying, and you could totally miss out on the last dungeon and everything that ties up the other loose ends, and I don't particularly like that. It's just weird that on several different occasions, the developers here decided that they were going to make it extraordinarily obtuse for the players to find everything that the game has to offer. I don't know, it just feels weird. That aside, I did really enjoy the story for the most part. It played out similar to 5 in that a bulk of it is spent exploring each of the characters that eventually join your party with an overarching goal tying it all together, in this case that being solving the mystery of the TV and the serial murders. I wasn't extremely invested in the whodunit side of things, partially because I was unfortunately spoiled on the fact that Adachi was at least evil, so I knew he was going to play a role somehow, so that twist didn't quite hit for me, but I didn't find that really ruined my experience in any significant way. The most engaging part for me was the entire hospital sequence, where honestly it became pretty believable that Nanako actually just fucking dies. I legit felt my heart sink for a second when the little heart rate beepy machine flatlined. It was a really sad moment that actually had an impact on me and was far and away the best moment in the story for me. Like I said before though, the social links and the characters were what really held my interest more than the main plot, and I think that was by design. There were definitely a couple things I wish the story expanded on more, mainly that for the most part, each of the characters that had a dungeon obviously had this repressed side of them that they had to confront and accept, which I really liked. But then once their dungeon was over, even like in maxing out their social links, most of the time those things were sort of brushed to the side. It's not as if they weren't ever mentioned again. Like in Kanji's case, his social link was about him embracing making those dolls for the kid, which I guess is sort of maybe tangentially related to him and his, repressed sexuality, identity stuff. But I don't know, it just sort of felt weird to me to like see into these characters' hearts only for those things to become secondary themes. Maybe it went over my head though, I could see that. I did romance every available option in this game just because I was curious to see what would happen, and honestly I came away feeling very satisfied with how they treated specifically Valentine's Day. You do select one person to spend the day with, but the game forces you to tell every other person you've romanced that you won't be spending the day with them, which obviously makes you feel like a piece of shit because, let's face it, you kind of are. That's just another thing that really makes the characters feel authentic and makes you feel not just invested, but responsible for what happens. I really like that. I also want to comment on the very end game twist, where it turned out that it was the gas station attendant the whole time. I'm gonna flat out say that I didn't like that very much. Like, yeah, it's one of those things where you could have picked up on it at the start, I guess, but I dislike when big twists happen that involve a character you barely saw at all. For a moment, I thought it was going to be Dojima that was the true bad guy, and that would have blown my mind because it wasn't foreshadowed or hinted at all. But instead it was just a cop-out of introducing the character for 5 seconds 70 hours before it actually becomes relevant. Apparently there are some things, such as like the attendant only showing up at the gas station on rainy days, but I don't know, it just didn't really do it for me. On the gameplay side of things, I have literally just 2 complaints and that's it. Everything else was stellar. I found the gameplay loop of doing a dungeon, beating it, then advancing social links and advancing the story so that you can get to the next dungeon where you can fuse newer and more powerful personas very engaging and fun. The combat was enjoyable, even for someone like me who doesn't love turn-based combat generally. Persona is just basically glorified Pokemon when it comes to combat, so it's hard to dislike. I really like finding a new shadow, figuring out its weakness, and then knowing that weakness when you see it again. It's a very tangible way to feel like you're learning from every fight, so that you know how to approach future battles. Shuffle time was also a really cool mechanic, with the constant choice of either taking lesser rewards in order to guarantee a sweep bonus, or not going for a sweep bonus and taking only the rewards that benefit you. Every single dungeon, except for one, but I'll get there, had such a distinct theme that made me very eager to see what the next one would be. I thought that going to the randomly generated style of dungeon compared to the deliberately designed ones in 5 would be a huge detriment, but honestly it didn't make a difference for me at all. The bathhouse, the video game, Heaven, and Adachi's dungeons were the standouts for me, but every other dungeon was extremely enjoyable. Except Marie's, the Hollow Forest. Honestly, I didn't get this at all. I found nothing enjoyable about getting to a dungeon where you don't have any of the items or gear you'd amassed over the previous 60 hours or so, your SP constantly drains, and on half the floors you get into a fight every time you open a door. The concept was decent, I guess, and I did enjoy the aspect of having to get those elemental items to weaken the boss, but the execution as a whole just felt like a slog, and I didn't really like it at all. The only other complaint here for me is the final boss, Izanami. Up until literally that boss, I felt the game was perfectly balanced, with each boss taking me 1 or 2, sometimes 3 or 4 tries to beat, but it always felt fair. Until Izanami, specifically the second phase where I'd get hit by a Megadolaon, or however you say that, followed by that like Fury of Yasugami attack, and it would just wipe my whole party or wipe like 2 of my party, and then I'd be stuck in this endless cycle of resurrecting and healing until I just died. Honestly, I did have to turn the difficulty down here. I could have either grinded until I was strong enough or grinded until I could fuse a persona with Debilitate or something, but neither of those were something that I wanted to do nor felt would be enjoyable to do. It just felt weird to me that I could breeze through that final dungeon entirely and then just get mollywopped by the final boss. That's just me though. I understand I might get some flack for that approach, but that's how I felt. I realize I've definitely been more negative and critical than not here, but I think that's just kind of how this goes. You know, when you enjoy something so thoroughly, it's hard to not fixate on the very small handful of things you thought stood out as inconsistent with the otherwise, for lack of a better term, high quality. I loved this game. I loved its characters, I loved its combat, I loved its music, and I loved just every second I got to spend in its world. If there was something here I didn't mention, it's pretty safe to assume that I loved it because everything negative I thought about the game was stated here. And while I could go on and on about every single thing in this game that I loved, I don't feel like spending an hour doing that, and let's be real, you probably don't feel like spending an hour listening to that. I give Persona 4 Golden a solid 9.5 out of 10, which might be surprising based off of how critical I was in this video, but again, those criticisms were only small pieces of an otherwise delicious pie. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with what I said here, or if there's anything you want to hear my further thoughts on, let me know and I'll send a reply. Thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.